Good afternoon and welcome to the Cambridge Forum, discussing challenges of globalization, global engagement. I'm Roger Owen, Professor of History at Harvard University, and I'll be your moderator. After 9/11, everything changed. Suddenly, the United States was no longer secure. Or rather, suddenly Americans realized that they were part of an international web of military, diplomatic, and economic relationships rather than an autonomous superpower bestriding the globe. The nation responded with a burst of military activity and bellicose rhetoric that suggested the fight or flight response at work. And this sense of insecurity has not dissipated over the intervening years, suggesting a need to re-examine American strategies for engaging the world. How effective has the US military and diplomatic responses following 9/11 been in fostering genuine national security? How are the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan affecting US security interests? What role has traditional diplomacy been able to play in the post-9/11 world? How has America's international influence grown or declined in those parts of the world most rife with tension? These are some of the questions we will address as we examine the challenges of global engagement. And now to our first speaker, Mark N. Katz, who is Professor of Government and Politics at George Mason University. He writes about Russian foreign policy, the international relations of the Middle East, and transnational revolutionary movements. In addition to his numerous scholarly articles, Mark has written or edited 10 books, including Leaving Without Losing, The War on Terror After Iraq and Afghanistan, which is coming out from Johns Hopkins Press in April 2012. He previews that book here as he examines the relationships between the conceptual war on terror and the military engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan. What purposes did the declaration of a war on terror serve? As military personnel are withdrawn, what will become the idea of the war on terror? And how will these changes affect America's sense of security and confidence? Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Mark M. Katz.
Thank you, Professor Owen, for that very kind introduction. This is not my first visit to Cambridge. I got my PhD in political science at MIT in 1982. And the political science building E53 is very near the Kendall Square T station. And back then, the Kendall Square T station was, well, shall we say, kind of underwhelming area. It was all warehouses. In fact, some of the MIT offices were actually in warehouse buildings. And it was just pretty dull altogether. So on the way here this morning, I couldn't resist, got in a little bit early. So I came up at the Kendall Square T station, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It's now all gentrified and lovely, and clearly I came at the wrong time. I should have come later, but that's the opportunity that I had. So anyway, it's good to be back here in Cambridge again. Well, I want to talk about this large subject. Hope I can do it some justice. Can't do it complete justice, but I shall give it a try. In a New York Times op-ed piece published on February 2nd, 1981, Henry S. Beenan, an Africa specialist then at Princeton University, discussed how globalists and regionalists advocated differing foreign policy approaches for the United States. Globalists, Beenan noted, believe that weakening military positions will lead ineluctably to weakening economic ones, and that in any case, security interests defined first in military terms must be paramount in any discussion of United States policy. Beenan, though, declared that he preferred the regionalist approach. As he put it, since this perspective starts with the assumption that unless one knows what is possible in specific contexts, and unless one has a good understanding of local factors that are operating, policies are likely to fail or to be counterproductive. No accurate analysis of the trade-offs between costs and benefits of different policies can be made without a deep understanding of the specific configurations of power in given countries. Beenan wrote this article during the Cold War, which in 1981 was not going well for the US, especially in what was then known as the Third World. After years of fighting an unpopular war there, the US had withdrawn from Indochina in 1973. This was followed by the fall of American-backed regimes, not just in this region, but in several others during the 1970s. In addition, there were military interventions on the part of the Soviets and their allies in Angola, the Horn of Africa, Cambodia, and Afghanistan, which in 1981 appeared to be largely successful. The globalists saw this as their worst fear coming true. American withdrawal led to communist expansion. For the regionalists, though, it was ill-conceived American foreign policies which had underestimated the importance of local factors that resulted in America's Cold War adversaries making gains vis-a-vis the United States. Now, the Cold War is long over, but what Beenan wrote about American foreign policy with regard to it back in 1981 is also, I believe, true with regard to American foreign policy toward the war on terror ever since the September 11, 2001 attacks on the US. Globalists have been primarily concerned about the, quote, global threat, unquote, posed by al-Qaeda and its allies, both actual and perceived, and with defeating this threat militarily. Regionalists, by contrast, have been fearful that America's deepening military involvements in Afghanistan and Iraq were so unpopular in these countries that they were creating more enemies in them than they were eliminating. But just as with the Cold War, it was the globalists and not the regionalists who were in control of formulating American foreign policy toward the war on terror, especially during the George W. Bush administration. The Bush administration's intervention in Afghanistan shortly after the 9/11 terrorist attacks was in conformity with globalist logic. Because al-Qaeda was responsible for these attacks, and because it was then being hosted in Afghanistan by the Taliban regime, destroying the Taliban regime was seen as essential for defeating al-Qaeda. Although not the only reason why the US intervened in Iraq, many leading figures in the Bush administration, especially Vice President Cheney, believed that Saddam Hussein was allied to al-Qaeda and that destroying his regime would thus contribute to the defeat of al-Qaeda. Now, over a decade later, what have been the results of America's war on terror? On the positive side, the Taliban and the Saddam Hussein regimes were toppled. Elected governments have taken office in both countries, and more recently, Osama bin Laden and several other top al-Qaeda leaders have been eliminated. But there have been negative results as well. America and its allies have paid a high cost in terms of lives lost and resources expended in these two conflicts. The people of Afghanistan and Iraq, of course, have borne far higher human and material costs from the ongoing conflicts in their countries. Further, the elected governments in both countries have proven to be corrupt, authoritarian, and last but not least, quite ungrateful toward and uncooperative with the United States. While the US intervention in Iraq ended the Arab Sunni minority's domination of that country and allowed the Arab Shia majority to come to power via elections, harmony has not been established among Iraq's three principal communities, Arab Shias, Arab Sunnis, and Kurds. With the final departure of American armed forces from Iraq at the end of 2011, intercommunal conflict appears to be increasing. Even though large numbers of American and coalition forces are still present there, the Taliban and its allies, with help from Pakistan, have made an unwelcome comeback in much of Afghanistan. It does not seem likely that the impending withdrawal of American and coalition forces by the end of 2014 is going to weaken the Taliban, but only provide it with greater opportunity to regain power instead. Further, with America and its allies so heavily involved in Afghanistan and Iraq, al-Qaeda's affiliates were able to gain influence elsewhere, including in Yemen and Somalia. Finally, even though it has been gravely weakened by the death of bin Laden and many of its other top leaders, al-Qaeda Central remains venomously alive under the leadership of bin Laden's deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Did America have to pursue a globalist policy after 9/11 involving intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq? Could it have pursued a more nuanced, regionalist approach that avoided intervening in these countries and focused on dealing with al-Qaeda instead? Or could it have at least avoided intervening in Iraq and thus concentrated its efforts and resources on Afghanistan and al-Qaeda? Now, while interesting, even very interesting, these questions are moot. The Bush administration adopted globalist policies at the outset of the war on terror, and it is the legacy of its decisions that President Obama and probably subsequent presidents will have to deal with, are dealing with. President Obama, of course, has already withdrawn American forces from Iraq and has vowed to withdraw them from Afghanistan by 2014. Clearly, he does not share President Bush's globalist vision regarding the war on terror. President Obama also sees Iraq and Afghanistan as having a lower priority than President Bush did. But however much President Obama's decision to withdraw American forces from these two countries is prudent fiscally and popular both domestically and internationally, Obama's rejection of Bush's globalist approach to the war on terror is not the adoption of a regionalist approach toward it. While American intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq were unable to establish peace and prosperity in these two countries, American withdrawal from them will not do so either. Conflicts in these countries will continue, and forces hostile to America, its regional allies, and the people of these countries can be expected to try to get the upper hand in them. America then needs to have a policy toward them somewhere between the extremes of re-intervening on the one hand and doing nothing on the other. In order to do this successfully, the U.S. would do well to heed Professor Beenan's advice from over 3 decades ago to know what is possible in specific contexts and have a good understanding of local factors. We've already seen what can happen when this advice is ignored. Thank you very much. Sit or stand?
I think, which you would you prefer? I'm going to sit.
Okay, I think I have to stand because you have a microphone, but
Yes.
I don't.
Yes. You are joining us at the Cambridge Forum, listening to Mark N. Katz of George Mason University discussing the war on terror and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I will ask a couple of questions and then invite questions from the floor. I mean, the first would be to take us back to 9/11 and the interpretation of what seemed to most people an unbelievable, incomprehensible act. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about the thinking about that, why it was that the Bush administration was so quick to call this a war, and then why the war took the form that it did, rather than alternative responses. What was it about the fear and the incomprehension that led to that?
Very good questions. You know, I think that a lot had to do with the personality of President Bush, of Vice President Cheney, and of those who were close to them. I think that they were, you know, as we all were, genuinely appalled that these attacks took place, and the perpetrators had to be punished and eliminated, the assumption being that they could be punished and eliminated. And so I think that they didn't seem to even consider any other alternative, that maybe, you know, if al-Qaeda was the problem, that what we needed to do was to go after it, you know, through essentially police actions or special operations or something like this. But I remember, you know, George W. Bush's speech to the UN General Assembly shortly after 9/11, in which he made clear, and as far as he was concerned, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. In other words, not giving anyone any choice And of course, the Taliban government in particular, in other words, that they refused to give him up, after an ultimatum. I think that, and then of course we acted on it. And then of course it all seems so easy. I think remembering, 2001, the Taliban government fell at the end of December 2001 with only the intervention of some 25 American and NATO troops, and we had essentially organized the Afghans themselves, Northerners and Southerners, to do this. And so I think that, the reaction was an extreme one. The initial results seemed to be extraordinarily successful, so successful that I think that the Bush administration was emboldened to think that, well, going into Iraq would be just as easy. And then I remember after we went into Iraq, the talk was, well, where next will we liberate? Iran, Syria, that the idea was that we were unstoppable. And I think that there simply wasn't a sufficient degree of understanding. And I think specifically that there was a refusal to listen to or even consult the regional experts. I remember, in the wake of especially the intervention in Iraq, that people who had been Middle East specialists, Iraq specialists, that they complained, from the government that, they wanted to talk about, the morning after. They want to talk about what was going to happen, and the Bush administration simply assumed that everything was going to go fine. In other words, that the population would be grateful to the U.S. for having rescued it from Saddam Hussein. And of course, as we all know, it didn't work out this way. And so I think that the decision was made, on a, sort of the view of the world of a Manichaean basis. In other words, that our enemies are totally evil, we are totally right. And unlike during the Cold War, we can eliminate our enemies and do it quickly. And I think that these assumptions carried the Bush administration for quite a long time, and it seemed that they were even successful. But of course, as we know, it ended up being not one, but two quagmires.
Thank you very much. And my second question would be about why the Bush administration refused to listen to expert advice. And I think if I remember it, including, not that anybody asked me, but I was here at Harvard at the time, we would all have said, no, don't do it. So that, and for this reason and that reason. What I'm not sure is that we were very well, we would have had a very good answer. Suppose we do it, what are the main dangers we face? And this leads me to my second question, which is one of the results of the American and British occupation of Iraq has been an extreme form of sectarianism, which didn't exist before. And it's odd for an administration who said, or Bremner, the first administrator, that we don't want it to look like Lebanon, and it ends up looking exactly like Lebanon. And this is a paradox and a puzzle that I've never been able to work out, although I think I have some ideas about it. I don't know how you would address that.
Well, I think in terms of why they didn't listen to the regionalists, I think that this is a general problem with regard to U.S. policy, that the people who are elected, our leaders, tend not to be specialists in foreign policy. They're specialists in domestic policy. They're specialists in getting elected and re-elected. Foreign policy, international relations is an incredibly complex thing. And I think that they find us regionalists boring, that we're the ones who tell them about all this and that little difficulty and these and that little faction. And they just, what they want is for people who can tell them what can be done. And the globalists often have such a perspective. They know what can be done, or so they think. And, it sounds, much more helpful to them, as well as helpful to them, with their own domestic political ambitions. So this is the advice they tend to follow. The regionalists were just not that attractive. And where we tend to come in, if at all, is when things have been messed up by the globalists, and we have to extricate ourselves. But even then, I think the regionalists sometimes miss out, because then basically it's simply domestic factors that take over. We want out, and we're not so concerned about the consequences. And so I think that that's the real basic problem, that, you know, our political system, like probably everyone, prioritizes domestic concerns and foreign policy concerns for a country as large as ours, with two big oceans on either side and two lovely neighbors to north and south. We don't have to deal as well as clearly as smaller nations next to their adversaries have to deal. We can, or at least we've been able to pursue a more adventuresome policy, but often an unsuccessful. Now, in terms of how Iraq has ended up like Lebanon, you know, I think that the regionalists, the area specialists, would have predicted something like this, and I think they indeed did. In other words, that you know, Iraq is a highly artificial creation, that, you know, with these three communities, with the Sunni Arab minority ruling, obviously in a dictatorial manner, that if you went in and upset this, and, you know, the Sunni minority shouldn't have been ruling in such a manner, but what was going to be the consequence? That the consequence was probably going to be conflict. And unfortunately, I think the assumption was that, you know, somehow eventually everyone would see the sense of our American value of, you know, tolerance and, you know, overlooking these kinds of differences, that, you know, Lebanon was a sad exception. Who wanted to be like that? But I think what we've seen is that by what we have done is to create another Lebanon. And I would argue that something similar has happened in Afghanistan, that really the Taliban, in many respects, I think if this was the Cold War, we'd call it the Pashtun Liberation Front. That's what it really is centered on, the Pashtuns in Afghanistan, not the non-Pashtuns in the north. And I think that what we have in Afghanistan as well is a ethnic conflict. And I think that, you know, because of the legacy of history, of how these countries were created, how their borders were drawn, and, you know, often the colonial enterprise worked through working with minorities. In other words, you wanted some ally who was going to work with you, and often it would be a minority. And when the colonial powers left, often that minority stayed in office. You know, this was true of the the Arab Sunnis in Iraq. It's true of the Alawites in Syria when the French left. And there are several other cases that you can, you know, mention this. And so I think it's, you know, it's just not as simple as going in and, you know, holding elections and hoping everything is going to work out right, because unfortunately, the political parties that tend to form under these circumstances tend to be sharply divided along ethnic or sectarian lines. In other words, that, you know, a more gradual approach to democratization, you know, whatever that would be, might allow different communities to span those differences. But when suddenly, you know, a dictatorial regime ends, elections are held, I think that this is you know, an unfortunate result.
Thank you very much. The floor is now open for questions. If you would please, can you come to the microphone, and remember we're being broadcast. I think if you can stand, if you don't mind. Yes, please.
Thank you. I have two questions, but I ask you to only answer one. You choose. Question one is, if you were the re-elected Obama, what would your policy be vis-a-vis this issue? And question two is, what do you think about the United States working hard to promote a global police force under the total control of the United Nations?
I think I'll answer that first question. I think that, you know, President Obama, if re-elected, I think that he has done a service in essentially withdrawing American forces from Iraq and doing so from Afghanistan. These were huge commitments of resources, which and to the exclusion of everything else. And I think that, as with just anyone who's investing in terms of your own portfolio, are you just going to put all your money into 2 stocks and pray to God that they work? If they tank, but the rest of the market is not doing so badly, or even just stays the same, you're in trouble. And so I think that what President Obama has done is to simply to step back from these 2 priorities that the Bush administration had, to the exclusion of most everything else, and try to pursue a broader foreign policy, looking at all kinds of different aims. One might, argue with some of his priorities. There are those who feel that, he's now getting too involved into the whole Iranian affair. That on the other hand, I'm not him actually, so I'm not quite sure what would I do. Well, I think I would try to avoid any kind of attack on Iran, because I don't think that would end the Iranian nuclear program. I happened to actually visit Iran in 1992 and 2005. And one of the things that really shocked me about Iran, unlike all the Arab countries that I had visited, is that Iranians seem to be genuinely pro-American. I mean, they hate their government. Their government doesn't get along with the U.S., therefore they like the U.S. In other words, unlike the Arab countries where they hate their governments are allied to the U.S., therefore they hate the U.S. In Iran, I think one of the things that we have is this tremendous wellspring of goodwill that the Iranian public has toward the United States. And I would hope that we would not give that up. We would not squander that through an attack that probably wouldn't succeed militarily, but could well damage that asset that we do have. So that's what I would hope he would not do.
Any other questions, please? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for your talk. One thing that shocked me prior to the invasion of Iraq was that the liberals were divided, which I think helped facilitate that process, and a lot of it was the human rights dialogue. Can you speak about the way it seems that the human rights dialogue is sort of merging with this globalist view? This person's a dictator, let's go in there and we'll clean that up.
Yes, and we saw this actually at the end of the Cold War and in the 1990s. In particular, that intervention for national security goals was bad, but intervention for internationalist humanitarian purposes was good. And I remember the first Gulf War, 1990-91. People thought that to liberate Kuwait, it was going to be a long, drawn-out affair. Another Vietnam. Oh, this is going to be awful. And it was over and done with almost immediately. Now, part of the reason why it was so successful so quickly was because the George H.W. administration had far more limited goals. It was just to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. That was it, not to change the regime in Iraq itself. And I think that then, you'll recall that CNN was relatively new, and CNN adopted the cause of Somalia, that the government there collapsed, people were suffering, we had to do something, and there was a hue and cry about how we had to help the Somalis. The Bush administration didn't want to do it, but we did it. We went in and handed it off to the United Nations, and then it all went sour, and we ended up withdrawing. But there were other, indications. I think there was a humanitarian intervention in Haiti. I remember that, I believe his name was Randall Robinson, the head of the Trans-Africa Institute. He went on a hunger strike, and this was in the news, and as a result, we ended up becoming much more involved in Haiti and getting rid of the authoritarian government there. In other words, there were domestic constituencies who were in favor of this. I think that certainly with 9/11, that pretty much everyone seemed to be behind the intervention in Afghanistan. In other words, that it was for both national security purposes and humanitarian purposes to rescue the Afghans, especially Afghan women, from the clutches of the Taliban. Then, of course, with Iraq, I think then we started to see, a real division start to emerge, certainly globally. But I think that, I remember, a few years ago, even during the Bush administration, there were those who decried U.S. intervention in Iraq in particular because they wanted to see U.S. intervention in Darfur, in Sudan, for humanitarian purposes. So, there is this interesting desire that we see in the U.S., both on the part of some conservatives and some liberals, for intervention, although usually for, in different places and for different purposes.
I really wanted to apologize for missing almost the entire talk. I didn't know it was going to happen. But I wondered if you might, and I don't know whether you covered this already, but the question of the appropriateness, moral appropriateness, and strategic appropriateness of drone warfare utilized in order to combat terrorism. Do you agree with it? Drone.
Oh, uh-huh.
Yeah. Do you agree with it or disagree with it? Does it have, clearly it has certain, positive, it's fairly effective, but there seems to be a lot of collateral damage. It's not particularly honorable in the old-fashioned sense of, honorable combat, but then neither is terrorism. Particularly honorable at all. So I just wondered whether you wanted to had an opinion about that.
Good question. I'm not sure I have a very good answer, though. I think that certainly on, at first glance, these drone attacks seem attractive in the sense that, unlike intervening with a lot of men and materiel, where there's a lot of collateral damage, there's a lot of casualties, civilian casualties on our side, that drone attacks, well, they completely avoid casualties on our side. I think the idea is that you can, pinpoint target the people whom you want to target and to minimize civilian casualties. And that's all to the good. The problem, of course, is that you can't eliminate civilian casualties. Mistakes are made, and certainly the people who are on the receiving end, this isn't popular. It hasn't, I don't think it has done anything to improve our troubled relationship with Pakistan. Certainly, the Yemenis, where these attacks have been launched, they expressed the sentiment that you did. In other words, that this is a country where everyone is armed, unfortunately, and that, if you're going to fight us, you should come fight us like men. Now, I'm not sure we want to do that, but I think that there is definitely a real cost. In other words, it's not a panacea. And of course, we've seen the Obama administration, really make tremendous use of these. And again, I can understand why they would want to do it, but I fear that the cost in terms of bad will may be a long-term one.
Anybody else? Please, I think just come forward and line up if you feel like it.
10 years ago, Kennedy School of Government had a 2-day workshop, Globalization after September 11th. Has anything changed? Jeffrey Sachs, convener. I had my analysis of this Newsweek cover editorialized with 50 years of research on Nazism. My comments, Nazism, globalization, the Mideast crisis. with connecting dots. I spoke to 450 international developers. The tragedy of globalization, greed, run amok. There's no middle class. I'm working on a business that will invert the rich at the top, poor at the bottom. Palestinians in East Jerusalem will sponsor Jews in internet marketing to deliver products in Tel Aviv. 10 years later, we're going public. 5 years from now, Palestinians will have Jews selling Mercedes for them. I define as a feminist economist. Moderate women want to see their grandbabies, smile at them. Their bottom line is their grandbaby's bottom line. Divide and conquer into the Sinai, last man standing. You'll be hearing about Emmanuel Enterprises International Kingdom Way Marketing. They said after that conference, if me and my students ever get off the ground, we will nominate it for a Nobel Peace Prize. I want to see peace in the Middle East and in the world as a feminist.
Is this a comment or a question?
That was a comment.
Yes. Do you have a question?
Will you pray for me?
Yes, but just to comment on your comment. You know, I think that you know, globalization, as we have seen, you know, involves an awful lot of problems for an awful lot of people. I'm not quite sure what the alternative is, and I think that, you know, it's sort of like the same with capitalism domestically. That is, it involves a lot of inequities, but if you try to squelch it, you can get an awful lot more as well. In other words, that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Surely what we should try to do is to somehow regulate globalization. That ought to be how we should do this. And the trouble, of course, is that, you know, in that globalization is global, and we still are in a world of sovereign states when international organizations are weak, is that we're going to have to, I think, to get a handle on this, either strengthen international organizations or greatly strengthen international cooperation to deal with these many issues. And I think that, as with, the way capitalism developed in the 19th century, is that, problems arose before people even knew that these were going to happen. And it's going to be a long, slow process in dealing with these issues. But I think that over time, I am hopeful that, in fact, the international community can and will deal successfully with these issues.
Next question, Tim.
A question about the framework of analysis. I fear, and not that you're doing this intentionally, but I fear we're drifting towards a kind of fallacy of false dichotomies here between globalists and regionalists. And don't we need a little bit more subtlety about the actors involved? Because if you want another set of dichotomous oppositions, one would ask, is the Bush administration, who seemed to be acting after 9/11, acting autonomously? Or were they, in a sense, captive of a different group altogether? Maybe the Project for the New American Century or something like that. Many of whom were actually staffed in the same positions as the national security positions. On the other hand, the other dichotomy, or side of the dichotomy, would be, weren't the people in the administration effectively captives of the people they saw as their first allies? People like Charlie Bay and others who just sort of announced for them that there would be this Shiite uprising, and they sort of followed the narrative because they wanted to believe it. And they became prisoners of a whole other narrative. Now, you could set up the dichotomy in terms of, is it an ultra-right-wing conspiracy, or is it a local collaborator question? Both of which are different than regionalist and globalists that you seem to focus on, which seems to be primarily focused on people within State Department, say, the internal divisions there, rather than the larger context in which both are acting. Now again, if anyone had a little awareness in the administration, which they didn't at the time, of the larger history of imperial interventions, they'd be aware of these kinds of things because, you know, you can't study French imperialism in West Africa in the 19th century without realizing that it was driven by the railroads. It had little to do with, you know, who was in charge of the nation state, the French apparatus then. It had to do with the investment strategies of people who were building railroads. Similarly, people have made critiques of the British Empire in one theater or another, being driven by other interests than those that are represented in Whitehall, you know, the Foreign Office, as it were. So shouldn't we step back a bit and nuance the critique a little bit more than this fallacy of false dichotomies between globalists and regionalists?
Well, I guess I wouldn't say false dichotomies. Let's just say there are numerous dichotomies. Perhaps we can agree on that there's more than one set of dichotomies. But your remarks certainly remind me of what the Harvard professor, I think at the Kennedy School, Stephen M. Walt, wrote in his 1996 book, Revolution and War. And this exactly predicted the Chalabi phenomenon. In other words, that what happens is that emigres, you know, from from a place that wants to see the system change and of course get themselves in power, they come to the great powers and they tell them how awful it is back home, that it needs to change, and that it can change easily, that they know what's going on and you just support them, everything will be just fine. And in fact, what happens is that, you know, great powers, in fact, the leadership themselves, their information is skewed. Now, what I would also like to point out that one of the things that your comments, I think, brought to my mind is that I have long argued, unsuccessfully, I'm afraid, that the war on terror really isn't simply about terrorism, that Al-Qaeda and its affiliate organizations, while yes, they are terrorists, they are much more than terrorists. They're also revolutionaries and need to be understood as such. And you know, what is it that revolutionaries do, especially revolutionaries who espouse a transnational revolutionary ideology, is that they set forth an idea that appeals to many. It need not appeal to us, but if it appeals to many people, it's not a question of simply defeating it militarily. You can't defeat an idea by killing those who espouse it. In fact, in many respects, you may end up glorifying it, which I thought was very sad that, in fact, bin Laden was killed. I think that there's a risk that he may become glorified in death. I hope that doesn't happen, but that I think it would have been much better to put him on trial and see what just how petty an individual he really was. But what I think the important thing is that we are dealing with revolutionaries, and status quo powers in particular, at least when revolutionary challenges first confront them, are not good at dealing with this. They don't understand the appeal of the idea. The idea doesn't appeal to them, therefore how can it appeal to anybody else? They look at it in military terms, how it just needs to be defeated, and this is where the revolutionaries essentially draw them into their trap. Now, what happens, of course, is that if and when the revolutionaries do come to power, at least authoritarian ones, they often, instead of creating heaven on earth as they promise, they create hell on earth, as the Taliban did, as the Ayatollahs did, and one can think of many other examples. And so I think that again, it's a long-term process in terms of learning how to deal with them. But I think that this to me is one of the most important dichotomies, and I think it's a real dichotomy. In other words, that our adversaries at present are terrorists, but not only terrorists. If we just think of them as terrorists, we underestimate their true power, because they are revolutionaries and must be understood as revolutionaries with all their strengths and all their weaknesses.
We need a bit of time management, Tim, I think. And,
sorry, that's my fault.
No, that's fine. We have 6 or 7 minutes. just to make sure that, are there other people who wish to ask questions? You're going to ask a question.
I'm going to ask a question, yes. And I apologize, I missed some of your remarks, so if you've already talked about this, just tell me you have. I wanted to follow up on the line of talk you just had on the war on terror. As the war on terror manifested itself in a number of different ways, some of which were the military engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then Afghanistan again, which you talked about. But it had some domestic manifestations as well. I'm sure you took your shoes off this morning as you got ready to fly here. And I wonder what you see happening to the concept of the war on terror and its domestic realizations as we withdraw from the military engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan?
That's a very good question. Certainly we face something similar, with the end of the Cold War. As a matter of fact, I faced that question quite personally. I actually had an op-ed piece in the Washington Post in 1991 entitled, "Gorbachev Ruined My Career." I studied Soviet Third World relations. I was one of those who argued that they're not nearly as strong as we think they are. But so long as they appeared to be strong and people disagreed with me, at least there was an argument. Once it was clear that I was right, it was no longer interesting, and I suffered. My only consolation was that not only did he ruin my career, he ruined his own. But in any event, what happened was that I think that similarly with the war on terror, we have developed a whole bureaucratic infrastructure which people who have made careers, and I think these are quite honorable people, quite dedicated people, but basically this is their career, and what's going to happen once it's over? Well, those of us who are old enough to know what happened at the end of the Cold War know that there's a tremendous amount of downsizing, and there's a lot of people who, in fact, don't make the adjustment very successfully. And so I think that this is, part of the domestic cost we have paid. In other words, that so many resources, our human resources, material resources, were put into building this huge war on terror infrastructure, and of course deprived from other enterprises that may have been much more useful or needed. And now, of course, these people cannot switch easily. And of course, they're going to argue, I think they are arguing, but of course the war on terror really isn't over anyway. We can't afford to take away this establishment. In other words, we're not going to have a moment like the breakup of the USSR when it's like, oh, it really is over. That's the trouble, I think, with this, was that even though the threat is a far, far less of a threat than the Soviet Union ever was, that the fact that it remains at all, well, it'll continue to drive this process. And I think that there's a lot of people who fundamentally, for their own personal, professional well-being, it's very hard to acknowledge that maybe the war on terror is no longer as important as it once seemed.
Thank you very much, Mark Katz.